kinship today, a little family kinship, marriage stuff. Truly exciting material. I may have mentioned in the prompt, but no one took me up on it, that back in the day, say 70 years ago now, that anthropology, you would have come into a class like this and all we would be doing was kinship. Like we definitely have, that would be like half the class was doing these kinships. I'd make you do kinship charts. You'd have to memorize the 6 forms of kinship all around the world to the extent that, so you'd be doing these circles and triangles and stuff. To the extent that other people, outsiders, joke that anthropology had just become kinshipology. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why that was, why anthropologists got so hung up on kinship. And in some classes, I tried to reverse the order of the chapters that we were just had, because I think that, in some ways, it's because of anthropology's emphasis on kinship and familial relationships and trying to trace those out, that they ended up discovering all kinds of things about gender and sexuality that later on, like I said, with the feminists in the 1970s and feminist anthropology, were able to take some of those old kinship studies and be like, oh, wait a second, there's a whole bunch of crazy, interesting material in here if you just took it the right way, if you just interpreted it in the right way. But the early anthropologists were probably not going to interpret it in the right way. So there's a famous book by Lewis Henry Morgan, Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family. There it is, systems of blood relatedness and affinity, marriage, of the human family. And Lewis Henry Morgan is kind of a local hero around here. He was, he did a lot of his own anthropological work in upstate New York. The Department of Anthropology at Rochester, I think, is named after him. He's kind of an alternative to the Boas approach. He wasn't really an academic. As you may remember from our earliest class, he was a proponent of a unilinear or unilineal evolutionary model. So he believed that, all societies were kind of ranked from most primitive to most civilized. And this is what Boas ended up fighting against, if you remember. So, but I mean, he did do some really interesting work. There's a great book called On the American Beaver, for example, which is just fascinating stuff about, so he shouldn't be completely discarded, but a lot of his ideas were pretty, they were pretty much of his time. And so the idea was, the reason why the anthropologists were so into kinship at the time is because it was kind of assumed that kinship is just biology. Kinship is just, it's, hey, men and women need to get together to reproduce, and so they're going to reproduce in this way. And, that's just a biological fact, and when we think about kinship, we're just translating the biological facts into a cultural term. And so they'd go around the world and they'd figure, well, if somebody didn't have the right words for father or mother, or something, that they were somehow didn't know the biological facts, or that they were engaged in some sort of primitive, weird practices. And so it was this idea that in some ways that biology was the root of kinship, and the societies could be sort of ranked, again, from primitive to most civilized based on their kinship system. It was also something that was easy to send people out and get some sort of rapid knowledge. So you could send out, soldiers and missionaries and give them a page and say, well, just ask people, even if you don't speak the language, you can ask, well, what's the name of this person to you? What do you call this person? And so, let's say, I mean, there's a lot of kinship systems in the world where people would call, your father, but your father's brothers would also be called like father as well. And so people would get really freaked out by that and said that they were engaged in some sort of primitive promiscuity. when in fact that wasn't true at all. And there are a lot of other in other ways, other kinship terms can be very much more distinguishing than ours. For example, a lot of societies have different words for mother's mother's brother, uncle on your mother's side, and uncle on your father's side, because that will, those two people will be very different based on your descent relationships. So people got really into this. Like I said, it took a long time to sort of reorient the study of kinship. I wanted to mention, because it also goes back to something we were talking about, the idea of structural functionalism. So this was from the UK. The anthropologist Radcliffe Brown wrote a book called Structure and Function in Primitive Society. And what in some ways was super fascinating about this is the ways in which, we talked about structural functionalism as the ways in which a society was thought to be kind of a functioning unit, and that every part of it would have a function. Every part of the structure would have its own function. And kinship was kind of like a key to unlocking, people thought, what they thought of as primitive societies, that if you could somehow understand their kinship relationships, if you could sort them into a category, you could then find out something about their social life. And Radcliffe Brown had a really interesting essay in this, in which he talks about a society in which it was, a very, since we were just talking about sexuality, in general in this society, you would never talk about sex. They were very buttoned down, no jokes, just very, very Puritan when it came to talking about sex. Except, he noticed that whenever it was one young man and whenever one particular older woman would come over, all of a sudden they'd start joking about sex. There'd be all this sex talk, jokes, pulling, goofing around. And, it was like completely mystifying. It was not the man's wife until they finally figured out, wait a second, this is the mother-in-law relationship. And it's a very tense relationship in this society, especially at the beginning part of the marriage. And this was the way that they kind of handled the tension, was to make all these sex jokes and then go back to their regular life. So it was almost as if kinship could unlock. It was a kind of strange key to the workings of these kinds of societies, and people got really into it. One of the most famous books about descent. So descent is one way that we think of kinship, that sort of, the idea of being related to people back in time, your elders or your ancestors. And one of the most famous books about this was a book by Evans Pritchard on the New Era in the Sudan. And, again, it was the idea that how do people organize themselves in the absence of a state or a government or, a police force or laws. And this was particularly an issue for the New Era, because the British were trying to exercise colonial rule in this area, and they were facing enormous resistance and fighting from the New Era, and they couldn't figure out, well, how are these people organizing themselves? Like, they don't have a centralized government, but they seem to be resisting and fighting back, so what's going on? And Evans Pritchard's answer to this was that they were organizing themselves in these sort of patrilineal descent lines. So descent lines that were, not necessarily literally biologically associated with a number of founding fathers, but they would organize themselves in these fatherly lineages. So Evans Pritchard and others made a big deal about these kinship patterns. And like I said, in early anthropology, this would have been a huge part of this. There were, 6 different patterns, and you could explain all sorts of things about social life through them. In later work, we sort of kind of re-examined some of these ideas. And one of the things that we found out is that, it wasn't necessarily the anthropologists who were the most obsessed. Or, I mean, it wasn't necessarily the people themselves who were most obsessed with descent. It turned out that a lot of times it was people like the person with the name E. Evans Pritchard, who was very interested in descent and lineage and family trees and all these things. And so, in fact, in some ways, and one of you observed this is still the case in our own society, although we don't necessarily say that we organize ourselves by lineages, we sometimes are more obsessed with kinship, oftentimes more than the people we were studying at the time. The other thing that on re-examination, a lot of things that people figured out is that if you just go in and talk to people about who should marry whom, or how you should behave, or what is your social organization, you'll come up with, people will tell you, what should be done, or the rules, or the ideals. And those are often very different from the kind of, once you're doing actual anthropological fieldwork, the lived experience that you would have in these places. And so there's often a divergence between what are the sort of rules or guidelines in the lived experience there. The other thing that people realized is that, the idea of patrilineality, the idea of patrilineal organization was oftentimes a kind of reconstruction of something that may have been much more fluid than people were necessarily. It goes back to, it's kind of related to point 2, is that when you're just talking to someone about social organization, people can be like, oh yes, we honor our fathers all, and our patrilineage and all these things. But that is sometimes a reconstruction of something that is much more complicated in practice. And like I said, in re-examinations of this, they've said, well, it's not so clear that the Newer are simply a patrilineal society, that is, taking all their descent cues from the father's line. And finally, my favorite is that, what Goff, and she's the one who's quoted here as the re-examiner of Evans Pritchard work, is, they were in a resistance effort, and they were trying to resist the Brits. So, it's at a time when lineage and kinship might become super important. I mean, if you think about when you're going to war with somebody, all of a sudden the people that you most want, by your side are the people who you might consider closest to you. And so it could have been, or it's probably the case, that these ideas about who belonged to whom kind of were extremely important in the resistance effort. And so, in fact, some of the things that Evans Pritchard talked about, the importance of kinship to the Newer, may not have been as huge, or may have been very much a historical relationship there. So descent is one huge way in which we do kinship, and we can really get into those kinship charts. People get into genealogies all the time these days, so often taken from anthropology. The other, there's the descent, or what is called, the bloodline stuff. And then there's affinal ties, or affinity, or the ties of marriage. And, marriage, of course, we know it as a relationship of companionship and sanctioned sexual relationships between two people. But it also has a lot to do with how we legalize our inheritance patterns, who gets to inherit what, who is able to get stuff. It has a lot to do with how we organize our economy, how we organize our resources. And in many cases, in many societies, it also can have to do with political alliance, where you're trying to form ties with a neighboring group, or you're trying to form ties with a powerful family. And so marriage is one of the ways that we do that. And so in many societies, there's at least some form of arranged marriage, because these things are hugely important. Inheritance, your economic and political station, you don't want to leave that to chance and the whims of children. I mean, come on, we got some serious stuff to consider here. Now, of course, whenever we think about arranged marriage, we can go find the most extreme examples of arranged marriage. As we know, we can find, children being married off from too young an age. And of course, nobody wants to, probably somebody wants to do that, but that's something that is surely unjustified. But I would say that that's a pretty extreme example. I would say that most societies have some degree of arrangement, or some degree in which the grown-ups, so to speak, are trying to steer the marriage choices, or in some ways more determine what they are. Of course, this guest asks, well, come on, what about love? Because as we know, love is what we're supposed to be basing our marriages on. It's become very, very huge, very hugely important to us. And I guess, what I and others would say about that is that most societies, almost all societies, recognize the importance of romantic love. It's not that people fall in love all over the place and for hundreds of years, but most societies would consider, or have considered in the past, most societies would consider that, okay, there's romantic love, but you don't want to base your marriage. You don't want to base your marriage on that. You don't want, it's too fragile. It's too fleeting. And so, the idea that we should base marriages on romantic love is relatively recent. It comes to us from, those wonderful Jane Austen novels of 150 years ago. So it's like I said, it's not that romantic love is missing from other societies. It's just that you wouldn't want to gamble on it that much. And if you think about it, well, they would also say, well, love isn't something you don't start off being in love. You grow into love over time. You'll grow to love this person. And then I guess I would say, if you think about it, if you think about how many times, I'm not sure if this happens in your lives, but oftentimes when somebody says, I just fell in love with somebody, it's like it's as often used to get out of a relationship as it is to get into one. And so it's like some of the evolutionary biologists tell us that love is actually there to sort of spread things around, to kind of, make you crazy and do things that you might not have done. So a lot of people would consider it to be too fragile. That said, I would say that, like I said, romantic love has always been acknowledged in many different societies and for many years, and is pretty much, as Guest indicates here, has been on the rise in many different societies. So it's not just Western societies. If you look at television shows in almost any country today, it's a lot of romantic love has become the ideal in many societies as the basis for marriage. I put was on the rise there because I think this was true as of about 10 years ago, but I feel like there's been a tiny bit maybe of, I don't want to say backlash, but like there are some young people in other societies, maybe even in our own, who actually are wanting their parents and others to kind of help them out with their marriages. They feel like, it's a little too chancy out there in the romantic love business. So, I'm not sure about that. It's a little bit of a counter trend to the idea that everywhere people are basing themselves on romantic love. So we'll talk a little bit more about love stuff in a second. I want to go on to because Guest puts it in here, a fascinating topic actually in anthropology, which is the idea of the incest taboo. And the incest taboo is in some ways a universal. That is to say, that in every society, you're not supposed to marry people that are too close to you. So certainly not siblings. Don't want to get that close. And so, you know, if there are some examples of people who would marry their siblings, but you'd have to be divine. You know, sort of, you'd have to be of king, the children of kings or something, and so no one else was available to be married. You know, but that would be sort of because you're making a claim to be supernatural, right? In the natural world, in the human realm, you know, most societies have some form of an incest taboo. And it's really been a kind of ongoing anthropological issue why this would be. Now, on the one hand, people have been like, well, of course, it's just, you know, you don't want to be mixing those genes up too close. Who would want that? But it's actually not so obvious, at least biologically, genetically. Some of the more recent studies, even of first cousin marriage, have called into question that this would be necessarily a biological or genetic issue. That's kind of true. Thanks. Thanks, Rhea. A lot of people don't believe in marriage as much for what you're saying on the decline of love. Yeah, that's probably something that gets in there too. I'll have to think about that one. Well, let's put that on our thinking hat. Okay. A little bit more about the incest taboo, and then we will get back to this idea of love and who can marry whom in 1 second, I promise. So, you know, a lot of people don't. Of course, the siblings are too close. Cousins become kind of interesting. Most of us probably would consider first cousins too close, although there are a lot of examples of pretty prominent first cousin marriages in our own society. But in other societies, what are called cross cousins might be seen as an ideal marriage partner. And so as I said, in some societies, if you are in a patrilineal or a matrilineal society, you will consider yourself related to the people on your father's side or the people on your mother's side, but not really related to the other side. Okay, so let's see. Let me see if I can do this. Let's say we're in a matrilineal society, and there I am, ego. That's me. So if I'm in a matrilineal society, I consider my main relatives, or even maybe my only true relatives, to be those on my mother's side. So these would be my main cousins over here, and these would not be eligible marriage partners. But the people on my father's side, I'm not really related to them because they're in a different lineage. And so especially my father's sister's children would be not really considered my relatives. And so I'd know them. And in fact, there might be some advantage to forming some kind of marriage alliance with them, because it would bring your group closer, but it wouldn't be too close. And so even the idea of who is related to whom, as far as first cousins, can actually be cross-culturally variable, whether you live in what we call a bilateral kinship society, in which you think of yourselves as equally related to your mother and father's relatives, or whether you live in a unilineal descent, in which you're more related or only related to people on your father or your mother's side. So like I said, it actually has been, nobody's really figured out what the basis of the incest taboo is. I don't think there's been an actual sort of definitive statement, in part because it varies. Some truly kind of radical, well, perhaps not so radical feminist anthropologists have said, well, we probably shouldn't talk so much about the incest taboo since it's so regularly broken in American society. It's one of those things that people shudder about, but it actually gets broken way too much. And so maybe we should think about the ways in which it is violated. All right, so that actually brings us, or is related to, the topic of exogamy and endogamy, which is basically marrying out, your rules for how far away you should marry, and marrying in, your rules for how far in the group you should be. So exogamy is related to the incest taboo because you don't want to be too close. So in no society, and of course, closeness is defined cross-culturally differently, but you don't want to be too close, and so you need to be somewhat exogamous. Guest mentions kinship exogamous or kindred exogamous, which is what we do. We don't want to be with our own kindred. However, almost all groups have some idea about who you're the group in which you should marry, or that there should be some sort of in-group idea. And so returning to the idea of love, there's an interesting thing here is that we believe in our country, we truly believe that our marriages are based on love, and our marriages are based on our own personal choices and our own ideas and who we fall in love with. A little bit of destiny there too. But the funny thing is that even though we in the United States believe so much in love, we are almost entirely, like way, way, way up there, social class endogamous. It is actually very rare to see a marriage between two different social classes. For the most part, the wealthy are marrying each other, the working class are marrying each other, the upper middle class are marrying each other. I mean, not strictly. Every so often, there's examples of crossings, and you can shoot me down and say, well, I know my uncle did this and that. But it's actually quite statistically rare that you would ever go outside the social class bounds, even though our marriages are all based on love. So the question is, how do we keep believing in love and keep saying, well, marry whoever you want, darling, while still this class endogamy, and to a degree, race endogamy, persists? And so, I mean, guest also mentioned religious endogamy. I'm not sure that's as true anymore, but certainly class endogamy is hugely true. And for the most part, because class and race are often very interconnected, it happens that people really maintain endogamy. And that is despite the fact that, of course, fortunately, laws about so-called miscegenation, right? It used to be there were legal reasons why people could not be married if they were from different so-called races. But now, hopefully, there aren't legal reasons. But for the most part, we still have a pretty secure social class endogamy. So how does that happen? One simple way is that although you can marry anyone you like, they have to be somewhere. You have to be able to get to know them. And so sometimes you are simply limited to the people who are in your zip code. And as we talked about in our unit on race and racism, even though there aren't laws about where people can live, they are often sorted pretty much by wealth. And the people in your zip code are going to be the people that you basically meet, you go to school with, you interact with. And in this country, we are fairly well segregated, fairly segregated by wealth. Not entirely, but pretty close. And that's why our schools, in fact, maintain this kind of, for the most part, pretty segregated state. But there's another trick that we have to help us out in this, and that is college, which is to say that, you know, when we bring people, we can bring people from different parts of the country, from different zip codes, and we can put them together in a place. And used to be, then they could get together and be close to each other and have fun and, you know, develop romantic partnerships. Can't do that anymore, but someday we will be able to do this again, and our marriage patterns will work out. And so, you know, my zip code was rural Montana, and my wife's zip code is New Jersey, and you know, we got together basically in college, and you know, it's great because college is a wonderful sorter of social class, and so people from supposedly different backgrounds end up at very similar colleges, and in part because all of our standardized tests again sort very well according to social class or according to wealth, and then people meet each other of basically the same social class and get interested in each other. And I was struck by what Guest said here. It's a kind of a form of just making sure you're going to get married to the right people. These, you know, the people who have wealth send kids to elite private schools to meet future partners and encourage in-group marriage. So, you know, I mean, those of you who grew up in public school, you know that, yeah, they're mostly people like you, but boy, there's just a slight chance that you might meet somebody from the wrong side of the tracks. But boy, if you can get into those elite private schools, then you don't have to worry at all about that, because, hey, make sure that everybody's in the same social class. So this is an interesting, you know, an interesting little things that we can say, things that we can learn anthropologically about our own assumptions, about who should marry whom, about exogamy, out marriage, and endogamy, or in-group marriage. All right, marriage continued. A little bit on, nobody found this part. It was very brief in Guess, so we'll do it briefly too. Monogamy, you all know about. One person married to one person, to be contrasted with polygyny, or forms of marriage in which one person can be married to more than one person. Now, monogamy is probably a majority form of marriage across the world, even in societies that permit polygynous or polygamous marriages. Monogamous marriages are, in general, what people are doing. In most societies where polygynous marriages are permitted, we sort of get that confused with what is called, or what it, am I saying, oh, what did I want to say? Yes, I forgot to insert here, polygamy. So polygamy is being married to more than one person. Polygyny is specifically one man being married to more than one woman. We often, as I just did, conflate polygamy and polygyny because polygyny is more familiar to us, or we have, it's something that is permitted in probably the majority of the world's societies. It's usually the one poly form of marriage that more of us have heard about. But technically, one man being married to more than one woman is called polygyny. It's one particular type of polygamy. It's not the only one. In societies in which polygyny is permitted, it is actually usually something that is done by a minority of the men, and usually it is done by the wealthiest. And that is because in most of these societies, in order to have this sort of marriage, you have to be able to provide for more than one, provide for more than one woman. And so this is usually interestingly associated with social class and seen as kind of an ideal because it's, you know, something you can do from if you have enough money to do it. Guest mentions that, you know, sometimes every so often people will have these debates, and the people who engage in polygamous marriages will say, well, you know, you in the West are so high and mighty on your monogamy thing, but you don't really do monogamy. You do serial monogamy, which is basically the idea that you're married to one person for a while, and then you get married to somebody else as we go along. Also something we kind of often learn to do in college. The other form of polygamy is called polyandry, which is when one woman gets married to more than one man. Polyandry is a very rare, as a marriage form, it is extremely rare. There are a couple areas of the world, guest mentions Highland, Tibet, in which polyandry is or has been sanctioned. It's almost always what is called fraternal polyandry, which is a set of brothers who would get married to one woman. And it is seen as a way to keep resources and land in the family instead of splitting it up among a set of brothers. Again, it's usually done by the at least moderately well off in order to sort of preserve resources. So polyandry is a rare form of marriage. There has been, this was actually kind of re-examined recently. I sometimes assign this article. Some anthropologists are now saying that polyandry may be more common, maybe not as a sanctioned form of marriage, but as a sort of survival strategy and a way and a cultural idea in different places. And so there are places, for example, where when a woman gets pregnant, it might be seen as beneficial to take a second or a third father for the child. So this might not be a marriage relationship, but is kind of a polyandrous relationship in order to have multiple providers. So it's an interesting. This is actually a fairly readable and popular article if you want to check it out. All right, a couple other things from this chapter. One is about something that we were talking about before, which is the idea of how do ideas about kinship and family fit into the idea of the nation state? And not too long ago, we felt that kinship and marriage and family was something that was kind of going to fade out as an organizing principle of a country or a nation. And so the idea was that, oh yes, in other societies where they don't have centralized governments, that's where kinship becomes important. It does not seem to have faded out. And in fact, in some ways, the whole notion of a nation, as we talked about in an imagined community, is the notion that you are in some ways interrelated, related to the other people that belong to this territory. So we use all sorts of kinship metaphors in order to describe our country, in order to figure out who should be included and who should be excluded, is all about kinship. And, I think that anyone who's looking at the political scene of the United States over the last 20 years and realizes how many interconnected families have been sort of running for office, realize that kinship is hardly over as a way of maintaining or perpetuating or understanding political power. So there's some really interesting stuff about, I think, Israel and who is a Jew here. Also, going back to something that, going back to the descent issues, there's some stuff there about Guest's own study of, these Chinese patterns of descent, but how they're changing with immigration and migrating patterns. And of course that both sometimes overlaps with or in some ways counteracts the boundaries of the nation state. So that's kind of a really, both of these are really sort of fascinating sections about this tension between, what we might consider the traditional notions of who's related to whom and, the boundaries of citizenship and where people should be located in a country. Also, some really interesting stuff in here about the nuclear family. So the nuclear family has been assumed to be an ideal, the sort of mother, father, 2 kids, and a dog is assumed. The reason we call it the nuclear family was it was assumed to be at the nucleus of all kinship relations. And in our own society was seen as this sort of an enormous ideal. And Guest draws here on the work of Stephanie Kuntz, really interesting historian. She wrote a book called The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap, which is all about how, in fact, this ideal of the nuclear family really was not ever as realized as it was imagined when it was put forth as an ideal. And certainly in the last 30 years, it's probably been true that more people have decided to do different kinds of families, or there's been a lot of stress, you might say, on what we might consider the traditional nuclear family. But as Kuntz writes, it's not clear entirely that this was more than kind of a nostalgic ideal and not actually something that was realized across the US landscape. A couple of you pulled out some really interesting things that I just wanted to point out. I did not know this, but I looked it up and I think it's true. So you've heard the idea of blood is thicker than water, which that's all I had ever heard. And that's the idea that, well, the people you're related to by blood is more important than the people that you're related to by friendship, which is like water. I don't know if you've ever heard this. You may have heard this way. And I always used to say, well, but it turns out that sometimes friendship can be more important than, but the full quote, according to one of you, and I checked it out and I think it's true, from the Bible itself, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. So what this is actually saying is that the covenant, the sort of choices and agreements and alliances we make is actually thicker, more important than whatever happens to us descent-wise. As our commenter says, it's the exact opposite of what people usually think of when they say blood is thicker than water. So it's really interesting. I have to, like I said, this is kind of a revelation to me. I need to look more into this, but it speaks to what I think many of us experience is that, people talk about the families you choose, and it's not to ignore your biological family, but a lot of times, we choose to be close to people, and even if you are biologically related to somebody, that kinship tie has to be continually reinforced and made. It isn't just a given. Then, one of you pointed out something that comes up a little later is in the chapters, these are called new reproductive technologies. This came out a little bit in the section about who counts as Jewish. I mean, if you can have sort of one person who is the sperm donor, one person who is an egg donor, another person who is carrying that child as a surrogate mother, then, who is related to whom? And so these things about, who is related to whom and what counts as kinship and what counts as family have become even more complex. Now, this is, as Guest says, this is not a new thing, not an entirely new thing, but it certainly does bring new wrinkles to the picture when you have reproductive technologies that seem to be able to separate almost, we might say, the kind of genetic egg sperm thing from the biological development thing, and then in some cases transfer that biologically developed child over to the genetic parents. It's just it's complicated. Some people also have noted that there are new forms of kinship being made around, in some cases, organ donation, so that people will sort of form kinship-like ties after an organ donation has taken place. So these things are, I mean, there's not easy answers to them because they kind of mess with our traditional ideas of kinship. And so Guest, in the middle of this chapter on page 253, asks one of his Guest questions: are biology and marriage the only basis for kinship? This is one of those questions that I'm like, Guest, come on, man. You don't need to ask us this question anymore. We all know the answer by now. What do you say?
No.
Good, thank you. A big no. I mean, why even ask us anymore? Thank you, whoever unmuted to say that. The big no, right? I mean, it's like, no, they're not. So even if you are related to somebody biologically speaking or marriage speaking, you always have to be doing things to maintain that relationship. And you can form kinship-like relationships all over the place. Also, no class next time, no class Wednesday, because we've done a lot of